So that book I was reading, by the way, like that character, like one, you need to read it. Two, the character who said like, who doesn't like teaching, who doesn't love puppies, is like you if you used your powers for not great.
Okay, thanks for the like trigger warning.
Even to the point where like he's from Israel.
Oh wow!
And I was like, there are way too many similarities there. But I laughed, I cried, I literally.
Oh, that's
like,
good.
I was not expecting that from that book.
Oh, okay.
So yeah. Anyway,
we can also do book talks.
We can do book talks. Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. Gabrielle Zevin, great book. So, Guy.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm well, I think.
You think?
Well, talking about what we're going to talk today, which is the publication pipeline, that always gets me a little bit going emotionally.
Tell me more.
Writing was a hard habit to develop for me.
Okay.
I didn't have great examples in graduate school, so that was really difficult. I worked with two very experienced researchers who were on a track where they were publishing a lot, they were creating, and it seemed magical to me. They would sit down and suddenly there would be a grant proposal or something for publication kind of showing up. And I was looking at that and thinking, how do you do that? That seems magical to me. That seems like they know so much more. They gotta have some trick or some talent that I really do not possess. And so to this day, to a certain degree, I struggle with that. But one thing that I've learned from that is to bring students, graduate students, into my process and to say, this is how you do this. It's hard, it's sometimes painful, you gotta sit and you gotta sit again, and we meet on a regular basis, and we often just sit and write, which is the one thing that I think my graduate school experience didn't do for me, and to me. But we didn't just sit and write. So that conversation that we're gonna have about create a habit never actually happened, or at least I don't remember it happening. Maybe it was there. And it was doubly hard because my first...
absent that day. You were there. You were like, I'm staying home.
And so for me, that brings baggage that I've had to learn to deal with. And so that's still there. And my first language is not English. So that transition was difficult. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned throughout the years is that I'm not the only one struggling with prepositions. English speakers do that too. And prepositions is a really silly example of the challenge between languages, but it's actually real because I sit often with graduate students from other countries, and we really have discussions about, okay, we're saying in, but in English, is it of or for? And you can spend time just on that sometimes. Oh, yeah. Less productively, maybe, but it's part of the process.
Well, and this is all couched in this like notion of publish or perish with academic jobs, right? Like, it is one of the assumptions for most academic jobs that you apply for that you will be writing.
Yeah.
And so, how do you break down this like magical or seemingly magical process? Mm-hmm. Into things that are actually actionable.
Yeah.
Because like writing just doesn't happen. Like you don't, I always love talking with like, I remember my grandmother when I was writing my dissertation, she'd be like, so is your paper done yet? You know, like yes. This dissertation is just like one big check mark.
Yes.
And I think the same thing happens like post dissertation when you're like thinking about all the stuff you need to do that week and, you know, write manuscript, check, and that's the item on your to-do list. But do you ever actually get to mark that item off?
Not if it's a whole manuscript.
Right,
it's not
if it's a whole manuscript. So like
actionable.
So, like as we're thinking about academic writing, and maybe before we go into a how-to, it might be helpful to like talk about there's all kinds of like different genres. Right, with academic writing, there is, the most common, which are, journal articles, which tend to go to journals, periodicals that are typically focused around a particular idea or concept. Typically, they're supported by a professional organization. There's a peer review process normally for those articles that kind of complicate how you have to think about how long it takes from submitting an article to it actually appearing in print or online. Because there can be, what's the longest you've waited between submitting a manuscript and having it show up?
In the good old days, I've had twice the case that somebody lost the manuscript, especially between editors, because there were physical boxes.
Let's not scare people.
But eventually they got published. There's power in that moment, by the way. And we just had, with a colleague of mine, we just got accepted, and I think it's been over 2 years in different iterations of reviews, because it is very common. Actually, most publications, especially to journals, go through multiple iterations, and the first one is usually, it's not quite good enough, the revise and resubmit. It's not quite good enough, but you should work on it again and send it to us again, which is, I misunderstood when I was starting up as, oh my God, they didn't like it. And the answer is actually, yeah, they kind of did. They're just saying, you need to work a little bit more, but we kind of like it. And the odds immediately transform. But that's just a piece of that. So I've waited 2.5 years for publications, and you have to think that might happen. At best, it's probably a year.
Right. And I think that's something that I was not quite as prepared for, like getting a sense of how long it takes for something to go from accepted, and that doesn't include the revision process, to actually appearing in the journal as something that I can then list on my CV as like, done.
Yes.
I did this, right? So those are journal articles. There's also book chapters, which are not, you may disagree with me, but I don't know that they're necessarily as well regarded.
They are not.
As a refereed journal article.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? But I find them to be an interesting space to play with ideas and get some feedback on those ideas and think through ways to use them to support work that I do in journal articles. And those tend to have a slightly different time scale to them.
So I would add a third form, and that is proceedings. So proceedings are certain conferences when you actually get accepted, the paper or the abstract will be in a proceedings, which is counted as a publication, but not quite as much as a journal article, with a few exceptions. So there are actually conferences that are so highly selective that the proceedings are actually just as well regarded as a publication, and sometimes it's even harder to publish in those proceedings than other places. It's one of these things where you need to know your area really well, I think, to know how it's regarded, and ask, if you're just beginning, you're stepping out, ask the advantage of the proceeding. So what are you playing with? You're playing with the odds that you will get published, and especially early on, it is important to get published.
Publish or perish.
Yes. And so you want to go into the odds business. You have to think about odds. Journal articles, most of the professional journals that are well regarded are accepting 20% or less. That means that if you're sending something, you're 80 to 90% likely to get a no. And you have to know that. Because otherwise it's crushing. At this point in my career, it's not crushing anymore. It's like one more person doesn't like something I've written. Okay, moving on. But in the beginning, it was hard. The first time I got a response that said, you are not going to get published, I put it in a drawer and I let it wait 3 months. And then the editor wrote me a note and said, hey, we'd like to include your paper in the next issue if you can get to the corrections. And then I actually read the response.
So wait. It was a revise and resubmit?
It was a soft revise and resubmit. It's like, it was actually, we like it, but you need to do these 3 things.
Oh my gosh.
And I did not understand that well enough because I did not have the emotional intelligence and emotional capacity to actually take that, because I had a few rejections before that, and I'm like, I can't deal with this right now, so I literally put it in a drawer.
You did not have a Larry Mikuleski.
Okay, explain.
So Larry Mikuleski was one of my advising kind of people at Indiana, and his general rule of thumb was like, rejection happens. It's going to happen.
Yes.
Like, it's going to happen when you date. It's going to happen when you submit academic papers. Hopefully not in the same manner. But it's going to happen. And so when you get a rejection, you're going to have an emotional reaction, right? Because it's something that you've worked really hard on. You do what you did. You put it in a drawer. You give yourself 48 hours to have your feels and be in your feels about it and eat some ice cream and watch some sappy movies. And then you actually like read it.
Yeah.
Because like that's one of the cool things about like peer review is the fact that hopefully people have read through your materials and they're thinking through ways to make it better. That's not to say that like there's the reviewer too factor that sometimes comes in where they're like this study should have been this. Yes, but that wasn't my study. Like there's nothing I can do like with feedback that asks me to build a time machine, go back in time, redo my study. Like that's not helpful. But for the most part, I would say peer review is super helpful in helping me, even the rejections, think through how to come at that differently for the next time. And so that was always his point. Like you get 48 hours to be in your feels, and then you go back at it.
And that's why we want to give this advice, because not everybody gets this advice. You need to limit the time where you're reacting to it. And it gets better with time, because after you publish a few, that's one of the things that happens, is you get used to it. It's never fun to hear, no, we will not publish this, but whenever I go back, even when I originally think it's like, how can they not see the brilliance of this paper? But often, then I read the comments and I'm like, oh yeah, I can see that. I can see how, and often, I mean, sometimes it's just, that's not, you are reading this in a way we didn't intend, which means often, I just did not do a good enough job explaining what we wanted to do. So reading the critique, partially it's like, how good of a communicator are you? Is also a piece. Sometimes they give good suggestions. Sometimes it's like, I just didn't explain this very well. I need to go back and just open up that line of thought that I thought, if I write one line or sometimes one word, everybody understands what that is and what I'm thinking on the inside. Apparently they do not. But that's journal articles. But then if you think about a plan of where am I going to send things, then you do some things in proceedings and you do some things in chapters. Chapters in edited books have a much higher acceptance rate. And my experience is about 60 to 75%, sometimes even higher, especially if you're invited to submit. Proceedings are, again, considerably higher. It depends on the conference, but it is considerably higher. So. But again, because they are considered in different ways, you want to do different things in those things.
Right.
So the content is different as well.
And as you're thinking about, the other thing to be thinking about, and we'll talk more about this later, is things are going to hit at different times, right? And so as you're looking at what your targets are for your academic productivity within your job, you're going to want to be thinking through what's going to hit at the time scales that I need it to in order to meet expectations for whatever is laid out in my academic position, right? And so that all kind of is like the big ideas between or that undergird this idea that writing needs to be kind of a daily practice.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, and that's, as you were saying earlier, like that was the one thing that like it just seems like things just magically appear, right? Like I remember in grad school, Karen Woolwind would just like have these articles magically appear, and it was just amazing how that happened.
Yeah.
But the thing that finally kind of clued me in was she was a really good mentor in terms of thinking through how to show us as grad students like the time that she put into writing. And one of the things that she was very clear about was you schedule time with yourself to write, and you schedule time daily.
Yeah, and the way you schedule has a lot to do with what your other duties are and your personal life. So, for example, there was a period in my life, and that was actually a piece of advice from our previous dean, and that was early in the morning. I would wake up early. Around 5:30, I did a morning ritual, and then I had an hour before kids woke up, and we needed to start delivering, because I had 4 kids at that time. We needed to deliver 4 kids to 4 different schools for a few years. Mayhem started at that moment, and then going to teach, and everything else happened during the day. And I knew I wouldn't have, because writing doesn't require just time, but it requires quiet, distraction-free time. You need to close down. So during that hour that I had in the morning, I turned off all the bells and whistles. Actually, I turned them off forever. My phone doesn't buzz, my email doesn't shine, I don't have too many counters that say, there are things waiting for your attention, and I would just sit and write. And that was a golden opportunity. Other times it happened in the afternoons when I started finding time during the day. It happened in other times. Then I became an administrator, and I had to again find critical times where I knew I wasn't in the office, because if you're in the office and you're an administrator, or sometimes as a teacher, you've got your students coming in and you want to give them the time, and you're going to, and that's fine. But then you've got to make sure that there's a separate time somewhere in your day, even if you have to leave campus. And I simply would leave campus an hour early. I would go to a coffee shop and sit for an hour and work, because again, it's got to be daily. And I've had too many graduate students, especially at the dissertation phase, that would say, oh, I'm going to take 2 weeks and go to the New Mexico mountains and write, and the dissertation will be done. And it's like, writing never ever happens that way.
But isn't that like the myth of writing though? Like,
yes.
I think Amy Poehler writes about this so beautifully in her book, where she was like, I had this vision that I was going to be writing in my Lake Tahoe resort, and I was going to be wearing the robe, and it was just going to be this thing. And like, the reality of it is, like, you show up every day in front of your computer with your data, with your lit review, and you plug away at it.
Yeah.
And some days you write 100 words, some days you write 600 words. But the important thing there is that you're writing it. You've scheduled time with yourself to do this work.
Yeah.
And you stick with it. Like, this is probably one of the easiest things to give up.
Yes. In your day. Yeah.
In your day, like, oh, I'm going to give up my writing time. But I've literally, in my Outlook calendar, have scheduled my writing times, and those don't get interrupted. Like, those, sorry, I can't meet with you then.
Yeah.
I can't, like, it's part of my job description that I do this. And I'm in a little bit of a sticky situation because of I had some medical stuff happen in the spring that totally messed up my publishing pipeline. I missed some revise and resubmits. Those journals have been very nice and have allowed me to resubmit those materials, but like, I had a good 3 months while I recovered that I couldn't engage in daily practice, partially because Oxy is, bad. Back surgery is not fun. And trying to like string together a coherent academic thought was not gonna happen, right? So like,
yeah.
But I found myself in the position where like having to get back into that daily practice, and you've seen me this semester, just like getting back into it.
It's hard.
Writing daily, right? And particularly when you've worked really hard at establishing your pipeline and then find out that you have to redo it because your body's just decided you're middle-aged now and it's going to break and it's going to cause problems. And it happens.
So in terms of a longer career, I don't want to say long career, but a longer career, you also have to identify, and that goes back to finding that time, is that at different points in our lives, we function differently. So I used to be able to write at night, fairly late at night. Being a night person, that thing went, and I went to an early morning. So you have to realize also that you can't fight whatever's happening around you, and you have to consider it and just find new ways. And this is where having an accountability partner that is also somebody...
Accountability buddies.
Okay.
Do you not like accountability buddies?
I don't think I can say that, actually. Accountability buddies?
Accountability buddies.
Accountability buddies. All right.
Oh,
accountability
look
buddies.
at
that. That is critical because you can have that conversation. I've been scheduling this time. I've always counted on nighttime. This isn't working for me. So having somebody to talk through those moments is really important. Having an accountability buddy.
Oh, nicely done.
Is
proud of you.
Is critical because, again, going back to nobody sees when you give up on writing, right? Nobody can see that except you. So it's the easiest thing to give up on, and it's the most stressful thing to give up on because it accumulates, and you don't practice that muscle of just sitting down and producing, and that's kind of snowballs in many, many ways. And so creating that situation where you're either writing with somebody or you're whatever your choices are.
At least you're making someone aware, right?
Yes.
Like all this semester I've been like, this is what I'm working on, guy.
Yeah.
And you've held me accountable to it, and it's in.
That's right. Yeah.
Right? So like...
And we do that with others, and I do that a lot with graduate students and junior faculty, is we sit together. For me, the most effective way is actually to sit with other people, because when I'm on my own, I'm a lot less accountable, and I find lots of other things to do.
Well, and I think, too, there's an important part there where, like, when we sit down and we write as a group, it's what is your goal today? Is it, instead of, like, write manuscript, it's I'm going to write 300 words on my literature review. I'm going to revise paragraphs 8 through 16. Like, actionable items are super important. Thinking through what is it that you will actually engage in that will get work done and push you forward with that manuscript daily is gonna lead up eventually to that, like, send manuscript in. Like, you can check that off, but it's all these smaller actions that add up to that bigger action.
And the thing that helps, and it's not exactly around this topic, but the thing that I find helping, and you talked about Amy Poehler, and I think about other authors that I've read throughout the years, is that reading about other writers and how they go through their process is critical, because it reinvigorates you. When you hear that John Grisham or whoever it is that you're reading at that moment, that's what they do. They like, we are authors, we take 6 hours every morning, we wake up. That's what most of them would say when they're honest about it. I have a schedule and I sit down and I write, and then when I'm done writing, I do other things. It's a job. And I prepare and I have my corner and everything is ready so I don't waste time. And reading that repeatedly, I find myself having to go back to my favorite authors about writing repeatedly to just remind me, yes, everybody goes through this. It's painful even for people who, I mean, writing is part of our making a living. It's not everything, but even people who do this every day have to work at it, have to set a schedule, have to really have a sense of how do I get from point A to point B, what are the pieces.
Well, and I think too, there's another shift there when we're talking about how to be successful in academic writing, where as a graduate student, you're very much used to, you're working on your dissertation. It's this one piece versus if you're really thinking about a publication pipeline and time scale, you have to work on multiple pieces at the same time. And I keep thinking of like Gary Schmidt, who writes children's literature, children's novels. He's also a professor, and he would talk about how he's got multiple projects going on at one time, and he's always shifting back and forth between them. So any given day as he's engaged in this daily practice, one day you might work on Article 1, you might work the next day on book chapter, you might work the next day on Article 3, but it's juggling the manuscripts. It's thinking through how you can work on multiple projects at one time. And that was for me at least, a slightly larger shift as I had to think a little bit more strategically about when I'm working on what and with whom. Yeah. So like, I know you have multiple projects. Yeah. Because like you said, you've pulled your grad students into that work. So as you're thinking about like, how many projects can you juggle? How many writing projects can you juggle at one time? What's kind of your rule for that? I'm a 3 kind of guy. I feel like I can juggle 3 fairly well. When I get into 4, things start slipping up.
So for me, I think about it a little bit wider. So it's not just the writing and publication. This is where it gets longer, especially when you do empirical research. There's also the grant writing and then the data collection and the doing. And so it all leads. So I have probably 5 or 6 pieces at any given point. But because I tend to write with co-authors, I'm manipulating probably 2 to 3 texts at any given point. If there are more in my pipeline, I right now have probably 6 in my pipeline, that means that somebody else is right now doing a piece of the writing. One of a graduate student or a colleague is doing the method section or the results section. Right. And I'm not touching it right now. I'll get back to it when we finish. And especially in quantitative analysis, you got to get through the analysis first because you don't know where it's going to take you in some ways. And it reshapes not necessarily the lit review, but it's going to reshape everything that happens later. So for example, we're looking right now at how parents communicate with schools through digital means. This is a bigger part of a bigger analysis of some federally collected data. And before we saw the results, we can guess at it, but we didn't know what we were going to find. So right now somebody else is doing that piece, and then I'll come back at the end and help with the discussion.
So it feels like actively you're at right 3. Around the same number that I tend to be
think
at.
that more than that, your brain is starting to
I just find
unglued.
I lose the details. Yeah. And that's problematic. Yeah. Very problematic. But you also highlight a big part of the publication pipeline is not just making sure that you've scheduled time for your writing, but that you have active data collection happening. Like you're writing about data you've collected past tense. Yeah. And then you're also actively collecting new data for once you get those manuscripts out, you can move on to your next manuscript, thinking about like what's the next piece you're going to be moving on. So it's this constant iterative cycle of building up literally that pipeline, making sure you have something to move to next.
And something that I think is really important and is going to be really helpful for anybody who's starting out, again, as a graduate student, definitely, and as an early career scholar, is map the terrain of publications in your field. Know which journals are publishing, what are they publishing, what are their acceptance rates. Read a few things from each one of those so you know what the genre is, how long it's going to be, because often I'm right now sitting on a manuscript that's about 15,000 words, which nobody almost publishes in journals. We need to shrink it, but there's a difference between shrinking it to about 10,000 words, which is a longer piece in a journal, and 7,500 words, which is
Can you
tiny.
Break it in 2?
And sometimes we break it in 2, and sometimes there's not enough, but you've got to often, I think, as scholars, we try to be holistic and include a lot. And often, especially in large projects, there's just too much. Nobody can read it. Maybe if you wrote it as a manuscript, as a book, which we haven't talked about books. But if you want to publish a manuscript, maybe that will work. But in any other world, you've got to chop it up, and it feels artificial, and it feels like you're not giving the complexity its due. But there's no way to fit, a 5-year project into a 7,000 word document and do it justice. You got to do it in pieces. And that's where the pipeline comes in. It's like, I'm going to do this piece early on, and this piece in the middle, and this piece at the end. Longer-term projects, that's advice we just talked about. If you have a long-term project, don't wait till it's done to start publishing. That's too late. Especially if you're early career, if you're a graduate student, you want to start publishing early, because if it's a 5-year project, right now I have a 5-year project. If I wait 5 years and then the 2 years it gets to get published, that means for 7 years maybe nothing is happening. That is not acceptable. You've got to have a pipeline.
Well, and the other thing to think about in terms of like which slice of this study are you talking about? Like, think about your citations as, in your publication pipeline, really as chapters in that larger project, in that larger story. How are you packaging with enough complexity to understand this slice, but how this slice relates to this slice? Like, your research articles and your book chapters and your books, if you write a book, should all be somewhat linked together to tell a more cohesive story. And I think that's part of the strategy of creating that publication pipeline, right?
So, and this is where early on, my advice, at least to graduate students especially, is diversify early. So say yes to almost any writing project in the beginning, because when you're just starting out, you don't know what you like writing, you don't know what speaks to you, you don't know which one of these avenues would be most helpful. And then as you become a professional, start narrowing down and focusing, because especially in that period, as young scholars, from getting the job to tenure, focus is what's going to get you there. And it can happen in other ways. It did for me. So I'll full disclosure, I had like 3 different areas of research early on, but that made for a complicated file to put together. That was not easy, and it was not universally well accepted. And so that's not what I would advise. It can happen, and you can make it through. I'm here. But it's a challenge. Usually what happens to scholars is they, and I don't know if that happened to you, but you kind of there are moments in your career when you can make a turn. For example, after you get tenure and you get promoted, you can rethink your research agenda and go in a completely new direction. And I did at that moment in time. There was time, I got healthier too, really important. But I also thought about my career, and I thought, okay, I've done all of these things, but right now I would like to focus. And that's when I started working on new media and technology integrated with literacy, and so I took a certain turn. But it was, at that point in time, I was mature enough to think about it as I'm now pivoting, because this is a good time to do a pivot and commit to a new direction, which I've been on since. So it doesn't mean it's the only thing I do.
I mean, you're a jack of all trades.
I am. Sometimes usefully.
I mean,
and sometimes less.
I would say 98% usefully.
Okay, I'll take that, but it has a cost, and that is I run between manuscripts right now. The 3 that I'm working on actively are very, very different, and the advantage is I'm finding points of convergence suddenly, where it's like, oh, and I have an internal revelation of I can bring those 2 pieces together. So teacher agency is one of those things for me right now that is very current. But so there's advantages there. But yes, it is about having a program and kind of charting this out. And I'm finding as I'm gaining experience, I'm more structured. So I'm more in the direction of having Excel sheets and meeting schedules and all of that I did not have early in my career. And I find this extremely helpful.
See?
I'm coming over to the Excel side.
Well, I need you to come into the Google Sheets side, because Excel is a little clunky, but...
Oh, yeah, we haven't said this, and Google is not paying us, but Google Docs is the magic of writing with other people.
Oh my gosh, if I could...
There's nothing better.
If I had a nickel for every time I have written on an academic manuscript while in line at a Target, I would probably at least have enough money to get a soda out of the soda machine, and that's at least $2. So, I mean, it's that whole notion of like, writing is never like this perfect, I'm gonna sit at my desk and the wind is gonna blow the trees and the cherry blossoms and I'm gonna listen to classical music and I'm just gonna type away. Like, that's not when it happens. It happens when, oh, I thought about this sentence, let me get out my phone, get into my Google Drive, okay, done, and then I move on. Like, it happens in starts and stops, and it's not always pretty, but it is this hustle, it's this daily practice that once you schedule that time, you sit and you work on something actionable.
And two things that I want to throw when you talk about that daily practice. One is that keeps, going back to your idea about sentences, that keeps those sentences and those topics alive in your brain, which means you're constantly thinking about it. When you leave a manuscript for 2 months, which has just happened to me with a colleague, coming back to it, you're like, you need 2 sessions of just remembering what was it that you were writing about and how. That's one. The second thing is, if you're having a hard time starting, one of the things that I've done early, and I still do occasionally, as an idea development lab of sorts, is blogging. I have a short blog, and I just throw ideas. They are never complete. They are never fully thought out. It's a place where I play with ideas that I will later will find their way to articles or to chapters or wherever, so fragments of those ideas. But I use that, first of all, just to write without the idea of, I'm going to get this published and people are going to like it or not like it, or I have to make it a complete idea. It's like, here's an idea, I send it out into the world. If anybody reads it, good for you. If you don't, I don't feel slighted, because I'm really doing that practice for me to play with ideas. So that's an easy start, especially if you're early in your career, but it actually works for me now too. But if you're early in your career and you're not sure about ideas and crafting and all of that, you can, I mean, the reason I do it in a blog is because it's a sort of a commitment that is different than just writing in a random document.
So I feel like we've covered a ton
Lots
of
of
stuff.
things, yes.
Like the different types of academic publishing. We haven't talked about books. Maybe we'll come back to that in another podcast. But this idea of showing up every day, doing really specific actionable writing work, thinking about what data you're collecting to lead to future manuscripts. Like, there's a lot of different balls to juggle here, while also thinking about multiple manuscripts at once. And these are all just tips and systems that make that magical work of like, oh, this grant showed up. Poof, they showed it. Like, but what's invisible, again, what we're trying to do with this entire podcast series is like make that invisible work visible. And part of that is showing up every day in front of your computer and wrestling with the beast that is language.
Yeah, and accountabilities.
Close, accountability buddies.
Accountabilities.
Accountability buddies.
Accountability buddies. That sounds like a hillbilly word.
Why you gotta go there, guy?
And I don't know, it rhymed. Anyway.
Accountability buddy and hillbilly?
Buddy. It had Billy in it.
What are you teaching your students about onset and rhyme in your class? This is what I need to know now. I have concerns.
We don't talk about hillbillies, if that's where you were going with this.
I'm more worried about the rhyme, the RH rhyme.
Okay.
Yeah, I have some concerns now.
Okay.
Some concerns.
You will be welcome in my classroom.
Except we teach at the same time, and you know this, and so I'm not going to be able to like do anything about it. This is how he operates. Yeah. But hopefully, all of that aside,
yes, right,
you've gotten some insights into how to construct a writing process when you're an academic, and that's part of your job.
Even though you're not that kind of doctor.
I'm not that kind of doctor. I'm a doctor that writes papers that 7 people read.
And 2 people cite.
And 2 people cite. Super excited.
All right.
My grandmother would be so proud.